Yes, thank you, Mandy. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. I think you're in for a real treat. Tim is going to deliver, I think, a fantastic talk, and he has a book to auction off to a lucky person here at the end of his talk. So that's more incentive yet to stick around. So by way of introduction, I thought I'd just tell a little bit of a story. I've been a homeowner for the better part of 15 years. And through that time, I've kind of taken it for granted, that I've had a place to live, and I haven't had to worry too much about that roof over my head. But last fall, I moved here to Saskatchewan, and I experienced a small, vanishingly small, but a small dose of the stress that comes from not having a place to live, and then living in a place where you're not going to stick around for very long. So I was in a rental place. I knew it wasn't going to be a permanent solution. And it was kind of disruptive after having lived in a place for a long time. And it was disruptive even for me, even for my family. We have good family dynamics. We're pretty lucky, fortunate folks. We have a lot more advantages than a lot of people do. And in that experience, it really hit me how big a deal the housing issue is. I've studied it for a better part of 10 years from a policy perspective, as somebody who worked for the credit unions sector, from a lending perspective, a banking perspective, but when you experience it, it really kind of foregrounds just how important an issue this is. So I think it's fair to say, actually, that housing is probably one of the dominant policy issues of our time, right? Especially if you have people that in Toronto or Vancouver, those places where the markets are tight or have been tight. And but it's also true in Saskatoon. Even in a place where there's seemingly an abundance of housing, there's a lot of land, and yet still people struggle with affordable housing. So how can that be? And what can we do about it? So I think there are very few people who are better placed to talk about this than Tim. Tim Ross is, probably some of you know by now, is the executive director of the Cooperative Housing Federation. And Tim, you'll tell me if I've gotten this right or not, but this is the organization that advocates on behalf of cooperative housing, cooperative homes across the country at the federal level, but also promotes the interests of cooperative housing as well. And now Tim comes by this role pretty naturally and honestly, I would say, this engagement with the cooperative space. I asked him to tell me a little bit something about himself that people might be surprised to learn. So Tim used to do this kind of, he had this profession, this time-honored profession that you no longer see practice anymore. It's called a newspaper delivery person. People remember what that is? Anyway, it was disrupted, of course, that sector. But he told me this story about when he was a young lad passing the papers. He used to have an account with CIBC, I take it, the bank, bad bank, in this small New Brunswick hometown. And of course, CIBC did what CIBC does, and they closed the branch in his hometown and left people without a banking institution. And the community rallied and got a credit union to set up a branch in his community, and his newspaper business was saved, basically. He was able to place his money in a place that was secure and continue on his merry way. I think Tim's resilience and his community's resilience, I think, at least in part, may have been inspired by Star Trek, because Tim tells me that he's also a Trekkie. And I said, well, that's interesting. What's the relationship with co-ops? He said, well, the Star Trek world is like a co-op world. I'm like, really? Tell me more. So he said, it seems like in the Star Trek world, people, their basic needs are met. People can self-actualize. They all kind of achieve their potential, right? Their specialties, and they do really well at them. And there's this kind of cooperative spirit that permeates the show. And I said, it's really too bad Brett Fairburn's not here, because this would have been a nice tie-in. Anyway, it's a beautiful place, this Star Trek future. But to get there, I think we need to work hard today. And Tim's going to talk to us a bit about how cooperative housing might play a role in getting us to this happy place in the future. So Tim, please welcome Tim. And I think we'll enjoy our talk.
Thank you so much. Well, that was a very generous and overly kind introduction, Marc-Andre. Thank you so much. Thanks to the center as well for the invitation to speak with you all today, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I know time is is a very precious thing, and it's great to see that, you know, there's some folks in this room who are curious or maybe already quite committed to cooperative housing here in this room. I also need to start with just also extending salutations to some of the members of the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada who are here tonight. That's actually who I work for. Our mission is to inspire, to represent, and to serve our members in a united cooperative housing movement across the country. And I'm extremely intimidated because I was just told seconds ago that you know, a few folks may have traveled from Moose Jaw to be here tonight. So thank you very much for joining in. CHF Canada is also committed to reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And I also wish to recognize that we're gathered on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Housing and a place to call home and community really does start with the land, and it's so important that we acknowledge that we are on treaty territory and we are guests here. So I guess we should begin. We are hearing an awful lot about home ownership and the lack of access and affordability all across the country. And this is taking up quite a bit of political airtime. So I wanted just to provide maybe a bit of an outline of what I hope to tackle in today's discussion, and also look forward to some questions and answers as well. But I'm going to take a fairly broad view with what I'm going to share here tonight. I'm going to speak specifically about housing as an issue in Canada and the policy landscape in Canada. I'm going to talk a lot about the role that the federal government has played in housing across the country. It's particularly important just to talk about this going into an election year. You know, the election is very close, and through some dialogue, I hope to be able to help folks or share some discerning questions to really evaluate what are the parties saying and what does that mean for my community, my housing needs and aspirations, and the whole economy as a whole. And I would suggest that federal leadership must include not only support to regulate access to home ownership, but it also needs to include really concrete and credible commitments to non-market and rental as well. Because when a housing market and when policies tilt too far towards home ownership, there is a boomerang effect that increases demand, increases prices, increases household debt, and puts the economy at risk. So I'd also suggest that co-op housing is a bit of a vaccine that helps inoculate our housing market against some of these troubling forces and troubling signals that we're seeing in the economy here today. So let's take a step back and think about housing in Canada. So, you know, our population's 37 million, and we're a country of home ownership, but 1 in 3 households rents in Canada, and 1.7 million households are in core housing need, which means that they're overpaying for their rent. They may be living in overcrowded or some unsuitable conditions. Across the country, about 40% of renter households are overpaying for their rent. And if you're overpaying for rent, you don't have enough left over to meet day-to-day needs or to save for the future. At the same time, there's even growing demand for rental housing across the country. Population growth, migration to urban centers is really putting a lot of pressure on housing markets, and we're not seeing a lot of new development of rental housing. And another serious trend that is worth monitoring very closely is the very high level of household indebtedness in Canada. So for every $1 Canadian household is earning, they owe $1.75 to somebody else. If we think about some of the principles of cooperative enterprise and co-op autonomy and individual autonomy, that's an interesting observation as well. If we think way back to 2015, there was a bit of a demographic shift in the voter turnout and voter bloc, and these millennials had a fairly significant influence and impact on the results of the last election. And as we go into 2019, the voter share of millennials will increase again. Some recent number crunching by Abacus Data shows that about 36% of eligible voters will fall into that millennial cohort. So parties are going to try to speak and perhaps tailor their plans and their messages to address that significant voter bloc. The question is, and this is a bit of anyone's guess, is are these millennials going to show up to the polls in 2019, or are they going to stay home? They showed up in 2015, but if we look at voter turnout in some of the provincial elections, not quite as many showed up. So so that's very big picture, high level look at housing in Canada. A couple more sort of tidbits, and maybe drilling down a little bit here in Saskatchewan as well. 1 in 5 renters in Saskatoon is paying more than 50% of their income on rent. Again, comparable to the Canadian stats, that about 1 in 3 households are renters in Saskatchewan. And 42%, it's actually greater than the national average, but 42% of renter households are overpaying in Saskatchewan. Going back and just talking about, so that those are some stats, but then coming back into the politics of the situation, going back to think of what are the top issues facing that millennial bloc of voters in this upcoming election and these times. Abacus Data research put housing affordability at the top. So this suggests to me, and it may suggest to you as well, that federal political parties that don't present credible and concrete commitments to addressing housing affordability, not only just in the home ownership side of the spectrum, but also in the non-market and rental market side of things, parties who don't put forward concrete and credible plans may not get the support of this growing voter bloc. So just overpaying. Yes, absolutely. If you're paying more than 30% of your income, to your rent and utilities, it's considered that you're overpaying or you're living in an unaffordable housing situation. Yes, yeah, and it gets while that may be tolerable at higher parts of the income spectrum, it becomes much more much more difficult the less you have. Just out of curiosity, how many folks in this room live in a housing co-op? Just so yes. How many folks in the room are renters? Yeah, and how many are homeowners? Homeowners, yeah. How many folks are concerned about housing affordability for either yourself or your family? Okay, interesting. All right. So I've got a bit of a pop quiz, and this is really about all of the attention that's going into the home ownership side of things and the federal role in home ownership. So, pop quiz. I got a question for you folks. Some of you might be aware of recent federal government interventions to restrict access or manage some risks in household indebtedness and risk of default for mortgage lenders. So there's a federal minister who tightened mortgage rules to cool off a very hot housing market. And critics are accusing this federal government of making it harder for first-time home buyers to enter the market. And this is what this federal minister said. You know, they're standing behind this decision to cool off the market, to make it harder to get a mortgage to buy a home. So the minister said, the housing market has softened somewhat, in part because of steps that I've taken, and I'm happy about that. Less demand, lower prices in the housing market are much better for Canadians than a boom followed by a bust. I'm all for a soft landing. Okay? So, was it? Who said it? Was it? Ralph Goodale, Minister of Finance from 2003 to 2006. How do we feel about Mr. Goodale? He's from Saskatchewan. Jim Flaherty, Minister of Finance from 2006 to 2014. Or was it the current Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau? Anyone want to take a guess? Ooh, we got a bit of okay. So we heard a little Flaherty. So if you think it's Flaherty, say Flaherty. Flaherty. If you think it's Morneau, say Morneau. Ooh. Okay. Does anyone think it's Goodale? Sure, I'll say. No, okay, so it's a bit. That's interesting. It sounds like half the room thinks it's Bill Morneau, and half the room thinks it's Jim Flaherty, and no one thinks it's Ralph Goodale. Or, well, sorry, one person thinks it's. My apologies. Okay, all right. So, for those of you who said it's Jim Flaherty, you're correct. Jim Flaherty said this on December 4th, 2012. So this is an indication, and it should underscore the fact that the federal government has played an ongoing role and a significant role in taking measures to try to cool down this raging hot housing market, and it's crossed, a partisan span from a former federal conservative Minister of Finance to a federal liberal Minister of Finance. So this is a bit of a deep dive, but I think it's important in thinking about the fact that the federal government has a role to play in addressing housing supply and affordability across the country. And we've been through a few different phases in Canada's history about the role that the federal government has had in making sure that there's an adequate supply of affordable homes, whether it's non-market, rental, or home ownership across the country. So the really tricky thing about housing is that it's something that you can invest in, it's something that's consumable, and it's something that's tradable. So, you can't invest in your bicycle, and your neighbor doesn't really want to buy your glass of milk that you poured, for yourself this morning, but housing is all three things at the same time. And Canada, through federal policy over time, has made our housing market extremely safe, which has made it a very attractive investment both for Canadians and for banks and for other interests as well. So this is a contributing factor for why housing might be so expensive and why there may be such a tight supply. But it wasn't always so. It wasn't always a given necessarily that the federal government had a role to play in housing. In fact, there's sort of four phases that I just want to highlight really quickly to bring us up to current times. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, I would call this the kind of reactive federalism period. Very, very strict interpretation of the British North America Act, where housing is a responsibility of the provinces and the federal government will not get involved. The federal government has no role. In fact, the role that the federal government did play was a very ad hoc and reactive basis through the early 19th century or through the late 19th century and early 20th century. It actually had to use the War Measures Act to actually create enough wiggle room to respond to the Halifax explosion and the redevelopment of the affected areas in Halifax and to help that community. It had to use the War Measures Act to provide enough housing for wartime workers in the First World War and those who were demobilizing. It had to really get its elbows out quite a bit to deal with episodes of significant labor and social strife, in the 1920s and in response to the recession. So that was a very reactive period in terms of the federal government's role in housing, and so. But all this really changed after the Second World War and the demobilization after the Second World War, where it was essentially such that there was such a population boom, and you had the demobilization of the military, but you also had a rapid urbanization that there was broad consensus and broad public support and significant federal leadership to really entrench a federal role for housing in Canada. So you saw this massive role in housing policy to accommodate population growth. You saw the creation of the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation. You saw new national housing acts come online, resulting in significant public subsidy of private rental, as well as non-market, non-profit, and cooperative homes. And you saw really robust supply programs developed through the 1970s and 80s in particular to develop this thing called community and cooperative housing, over 600,000 units of it across the country to really fulfill this promise to veterans and this needing to ensure that quality of life's offered to folks who sacrificed for the country and to accommodate this massive population boom. The next phase was really a period of retrenchment and devolution. So in the mid-1980s, right up until about 2008, into the 2000s, we saw fairly massive program cuts to these programs that were part of the welfare state that sponsored the development of community housing. We saw significant tax cuts. We saw really tremendous deregulation as well. And as well, we saw something happen kind of administratively in housing policy. The federal government kind of retreated a little bit and kind of went back to that late 19th century view of the British North America Act and said, provinces, you got this. So there were administrative agreements signed with provinces and territories to devolve the portfolio administration of community housing of nonprofits and co-ops across the country. So, pretty quiet period. But in the meantime, you know, demand was really stoked. Tax cuts, deregulation, fairly booming. You know, once there was a recovery from the recession in the earlier phase of that period, the housing market really started to boom, and we saw, you know, the effects of deinstitutionalization and a massive spike in homelessness in urban Canada across the country, sort of following that period of retrenchment and devolution. And then 2008 came around. The demand was really pumped for housing. You know, the new federal conservative government just brought in 40-year amortizations for mortgages, meaning you could take you could take out a mortgage and take 40 years to pay it down, resulting in a much larger interest being paid and more money for banks and so on. But the recession hit. Bank of Canada lowers its interest rates after some cajoling in a minority parliament at the time to stimulate some spending. The low interest rate environment really stimulated some borrowing. Canadians took on more and more debt to shoulder the recovery of the recession, and demand continued to spike again for housing. Interestingly, not as an outcome in and of itself as a housing policy, but as a measure of economic stimulus and job creation, the federal government then began to deliver billions of dollars in program funding again to develop nonprofit, community, and private rental housing again, as well as engage in the renovation of social housing. So, and then just back to what, you know, what Jim Flaherty started to do when he was finance minister. He realized we really need to cool demand in the housing market. We need to lower the amortization period of mortgages. The government actually did that 3 times, 40 to 35 years in 2008, 35 years to 30 in 2011, and then 30 to 25 in 2012 for lenders with less than a 20% down payment. And I don't know. I don't know how disruptive that was to credit unions at the time from a lender perspective, but you can see the finance minister at the time took very, you know, he stood behind these measures to cool demand in the housing market. So why the heck is all that background? I don't know if you found that useful or not, but why the heck is all that important? Because I think it really underscores the importance of protecting a segment of the market and promoting the growth of a form of housing that's vaccinated from boom and bust cycles in the economy. And cooperative housing is a part of that solution and really does that as well. So let's maybe talk a little bit. You came here to hear about co-op housing, so I better start talking about co-op housing. But co-op housing in Canada, just to give you a little bit of a bird's eye view, about 98,000 homes for 250,000 folks all across the country in every province and territory, including Hillside Housing Cooperative in Iqaluit, right on the Frobisher Bay. There's also a lot of housing co-ops across the country, about 2,300 across the country. And, you know, Saskatchewan, I probably don't need to tell anyone in this room the cooperative roots and the history of cooperative enterprise in this part of the country, but here we are proud to have 19 co-ops and about 920 homes. All that sounds really good until you start to think about the scale of the housing market overall, and we're actually only less than 1% of the housing market. So that's a bit of a concern, because in both Saskatchewan and across the country, because we're actually shrinking as a portion of the housing portfolio or the housing market over time, because every year more and more homes are built across the country. So that's a bit about co-op housing in Canada. For those of you who might be curious about what are some of the defining features of a co-op, of a housing co-op, well, I like to boil it down to four main points. Co-op homes are affordable forever, so they're vaccinated against the ups and downs and booms and busts of the economy and the housing market. Not completely vaccinated. There are vulnerabilities, but I will show you some of the pricing differences here in a couple of moments. Housing co-ops build stronger communities. I was a guest on the CBC Afternoon Edition yesterday, and one of the real pleasures of my job is actually, I am just a talking head, but actually going out and talking with members and hearing the very strong sense of community. Like Denise in downtown Toronto, who lives in a beautiful heritage co-op. She's got 3 young kids, and she knows that the neighbors are kind of keeping their eye out for the kids, and there's an informal childcare system there. Or there's Sarah in Thunder Bay, who at the age of, I think she's 18, 19, she got real skills development and leadership experience serving on committees and on the board of her cooperative. And I see the value as well in learning and development of members of co-ops. One of the principles of member education. I see members taking that on very seriously. James is on our national board, and he just completed the online program in governance here at the center. So I know this is taken very seriously. So you just get stronger, richer communities. The other piece is that housing co-ops are democratic and they're principled. These principles are alive and well within our movement, and the fact that co-ops are democratic is a part of what makes sure that people are put ahead of profits and that homes are affordable forever. I get a question a lot, because it's such a small, 1% of the housing market. I go out a lot and I try and find different ways of explaining what a housing co-op is, and people say, well, what's so great about a housing co-op? Who's the landlord? And I say democracy is actually your landlord, and it can be messy at times, but it puts the interests of the people who live there first. Every dollar of revenue that is raised in the housing co-op, in the majority of housing co-ops in Canada, it's reinvested into the quality of life and the affordability for the folks who live there. So that money stays local and generates activity in the economy. So those are really, really strong features of a housing co-op in Canada. So that's what I've tried to boil it down to in my short experience in the sector. But there's folks in the room here tonight who probably have better stories and anecdotes about what co-op living means to you. You don't just have to take my word for it. You go ahead and we've got a new Instagram account. I don't know if anyone's on Instagram, but we've got some pretty powerful visuals. This is actually the Old Grace Housing Co-op. It's a brand new co-op development in Winnipeg. Very, very desirable community and neighborhood with amenities and common space. Here's Vancouver's Pacific Heights Co-op with the cherry blossoms out. Okay, yeah, I want to get to a bit of a proof point, because we talk about the affordability of housing co-ops, but we don't always we don't always do a good job of sharing the data. So one unique feature of housing co-ops in Canada is as a membership association, we serve and represent our members, but we do kind of cool things to bring the sector together to really unite it. And we have a really strong data picture of the operating characteristics of co-ops, not all across the country, but a very significant sample size. So I can actually show you the difference between what it costs to live in a co-op and what it might cost to live in a market rental. So we know, and we can demonstrate through data, that money talks and co-ops are more affordable compared to private rental and condo rentals. It's a fact across the country. So let's have a look. Let's break this down a little bit. And I'm told I have a laser here, so I'm going to play with the laser a little bit. But here in this column, we've got it's kind of a faint laser. Here in this column, we have two-bedroom condo average costs. The center column, we have two-bedroom rental average costs. And then on the last column, we've got two-bedroom co-op average costs. So Canada, kind of providing statistics at a Canadian level is not very significant because all housing markets are very local. So it doesn't really come out very strongly Canada-wide, but it does hold true the whole way across. So let's go to some of the really extreme. Does anyone have any friends or family that live in Toronto and Vancouver right now? Are they miserable? Like, maybe you bought in and you're sitting on a jackpot there, but maybe you've got kids that are either still in the basement or need to teach English in Korea to get by. One of my colleagues, that's his case. Like his son either comes home and he's in the basement, or he's teaching English in Korea and doesn't have a connection to the family. Meanwhile, he's got aging parents who need to downsize and have a more accessible home, and it's just not available in Toronto. So yeah, these are the extreme examples, but we're going to get a little bit more comparable in a minute. But you can see the savings here. So two-bedroom co-op in Vancouver, it's $1,110 per month. Okay, it compared to $1,865 in a two-bedroom rental. You wonder, why do I put condo average costs up? It's because of this huge imbalance that we have in our housing markets across the country. We've stoked demand, for decades. We haven't done enough to necessarily cool the demand, and we've not done enough to invest in the creation of the right kind of supply of housing, the kind of housing that's vaccinated against the volatility of the housing market, like co-ops and nonprofits. No one's really building rental anymore, purpose-built rental. We're seeing some modest increases in the amount of purpose-built rental in most markets across the country, but it's for every unit of rental that's being built, purpose-built rental that's being constructed, we're actually losing a whole bunch to bulldozers and conversions into condominiums, and then those condominiums are in turn rented out because there's an investor who may or may not live in the city, and it's just where they're parking their money, and they're also getting some rental income from it. And oh my goodness, the costs of condo rentals are significant. So $2,385 in Vancouver, $2,400 in Toronto. So
is that rentals for the condo or ownership?
Rentals, yes, yeah. And this is 2017 data. There are more recent rental market survey data out. Came out in October 2018, but I don't have the updated co-op data, so I wanted to use a comparable. So,
how do you compare for quality of housing across these different categories?
Oh, that's an interesting question. What do you mean by that in terms of?
I mean, you can rent a two-bedroom apartment and it could be extremely nice and you could be very poor. Is this an average of across that whole range, or is it of a particular type?
Yeah, I'm using the CMHC rental market survey data, so it is an average of the surveyed universe. So it doesn't. These averages don't reflect necessarily the quality. And as a general trend, if you go on Kijiji right now and you actually look for a place where you'd want to live, right, in these markets, and you look at the rental and rented condo pricing, it's a lot higher than what you see in terms of these averages as well. So you say, okay, yeah, that's Toronto and Vancouver. Stop yakking about Toronto and Vancouver. We all know life is miserable in at least Toronto. Vancouver's pretty nice. I'm just kidding. I forget that I was being recorded. I love Toronto, and I'm enjoying the Raptors run, and yeah. But it's kind of fun to beat up on Toronto sometimes, right? Anyway, I'm from New Brunswick. So what about high vacancy? What about high vacancy markets where there's been a downturn in the economy? What does that do to pricing and availability? So, and then if we kind of follow, I'm not an economist, by the way, but if we sort of think about the supply and demand, if the demand, if the demand's kind of low and you've got an oversupply, should the prices not come down? Yes. Well, we're actually not seeing that happen in the price of housing in these high vacancy markets. We're seeing the prices come down modestly, but not really at a level that people can afford. So Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatoon. I put a big asterisk on Saskatoon because my sample sizes are very small. I called up James and I said, how much is the rent for a two-bedroom? So if anyone wants to live at Rainbow Co-op, you now know the rent structure. But how long do you manage a waiting list? Yeah.
Depending on the size of it, anywhere between 3 to 7 years.
Yeah. It goes back to that very low availability, 1% of the housing market. What would happen if we had 2, 5, 10%? Would that help? I think so. So yeah, you can see you can follow the line here. I don't need to speak to all the numbers, but Edmonton, $13.46 in a condo, $12.15 in a two-bedroom rental, and $1,000 in the co-op. So co-ops make life more affordable. If you don't have the money to save, thank goodness you're living in a co-op. If you do have the money to save, you're able to pay down maybe student debt, invest in the children's education savings plan, or maybe save up for a home. This is very positive and a big advantage to co-op housing. So yeah, even in the higher vacancy environments, you're seeing rent structures that are unaffordable for most people and put a real strain on people. So now what does this mean? Let's actually compare some of these figures in a little bit more detail. Comparing the cost differences over 1 year and over 5 years based on those 2017 average rents. So let's look at this in a couple markets. Because there's this, we often hear about the value of home ownership as being the best savings plan and a really safe investment. And that is true in a lot of cases. But we also hear all this stigma around people who aren't homeowners and saying, why pay your landlord's mortgage when you can pay your own? Or, why rent when you can own? Or, renters, well, they don't really care about their neighborhood. When you own it, you've got a lot of pride in your neighborhood. So let's dig into that a little bit. So in to what the member of a co-op pays on average in Vancouver of a 2-bedroom apartment, you're saving potentially $9,000 a year. If you can afford to save that, what would you do with it, right? And say you're living in the co-op for 5 years, you're saving about $45,000 if you can afford to pay it. That's just the difference between, you know, the average market rents and the average cost of living in a 2-bedroom co-op. If you're living in a rented condo, it's more. You're saving over $15,000 a year compared to what you'd be paying in the co-op. Contrasting that with maybe a higher vacancy environment. In 2017, on average, 2-bedroom co-op versus a rental, it's $3,259. Not bad, right? Edmonton, again, you're just around the $2,500 a year range. And then, interestingly, in Toronto, it's not quite as bad here, but you're getting about $3,666 in your pocket if you're in a private rental, or if you're in a 2-bedroom co-op versus a private rental. So significant savings there as well. What about the kind of year-over-year increases? I spoke a little bit to the security of tenure piece. Co-ops, because they're democratic and principled businesses that are responsive to the needs and aspirations of the people who live there, have built-in mechanisms to make sure that there's good governance, sound management, that the money is going to the right things, and costs are being properly controlled. So co-op costs remain stable with smaller year-over-year increases when compared to, and sorry this got reformatted, but to private and condo rentals. So instead of going through a whole bunch of examples, I'm just going to use one, and you'll just have to take my word for it, or we can talk later, that this is universal across all the markets that we looked at. But here's London, Ontario. And I'm giving you a broader range of the spectrum here. In London, Ontario, so we got 1-bedroom co-op, 1-bedroom market, 2-bedroom co-op, 2-bedroom market, 3-bedroom co-op, 3-bedroom market. So if you're in a 2-bedroom co-op, your average housing costs are $643 a month in London, Ontario in 2017. Whereas if you were in an average market unit, $1,037. So and it's just interesting to see that, living in a housing co-op in London, Ontario is still more affordable today, well in 2017, than it would have been 5 years earlier in London, Ontario. This was true across all markets. So that's a little bit about the value proposition of co-op housing, the structure of the sector, and some real-life comparisons between a fairly large sample size of co-op homes, of which we have a robust data set for across the country, and the average market rents as presented in the fall rental market surveys issued every year by the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation.
What is it about the co-op that's making the cost lower than the market? Because if we're going to develop a new co-op in Saskatoon today, we'd still have to pay the same land costs, same construction costs, same utility costs, same tax regime as private sector. So what is it about the co-op that they can deliver
So that's a good question. This takes a little bit of patience because the actual economics of housing development, you still have to pay a lot of the same costs, especially if you're doing it on your own without any government assistance or subsidy. So early on, those costs, the housing charges, the rent structure, are going to be, they're going to be around the median. This is what we're seeing with new developments. They're going to be around the median of market rents, but over time, because there is no profit to be taken out of the co-op, and because there is a democratic and principled governance and management structure, there is very strong oversight over the business and the budget that's passed every year that sets the housing charges. So there's a lot of scrutiny there to make sure that this annual operating budget is defensible. We're paying our mortgage, our maintenance and operations costs, and we're setting enough aside for future needs. And then everything after that is the discretion of the members. So that's where you see the gap and the greater affordability. And it gets more affordable over time as the market continues to as market rents continue to go up year over year.
Basically, the profit that's not being charged.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So and the data that I have here, these are based on a portfolio of co-ops that have been up and running for decades as well. So that's a factor as well. So you're seeing what some very mature housing co-ops are looking like in terms of their rent structure. I will say it's not all perfect and it's not all roses either. There are some perverse incentives that happen in that if that democratic and principled governance and management structure is misused, and rents and housing charge structures can be kept very artificially low at a very risky level that don't actually cover the real operating costs and cover the future capital repair needs of the co-op. So that's an ongoing issue, but it's something that can be a difficult conversation in communities because the members who have that democratic vote are benefiting from today's rent structure, but there's also this responsibility of stewardship into the future as well. So bit of a tangent, but a good question as well. I wanted to speak a little bit to the national housing strategy as well, just to kind of bring you up to date a little bit further. So I think I left off sort of the different phases of federal involvement in the housing market, in all parts of the housing market. So we're still very much in this Great Recession recovery stage. I think we're feeling it all very differently across the country. And there continues to be a very important role for the federal government in housing policy, in making sure the right kind of supply is being built to make sure that folks have a decent place to call home, and putting people ahead of profits. Some main features of the National Housing Strategy that was developed shortly after 2015, and it's focused on the part of the market that's really been neglected following that retrenchment and deregulation phase of the federal government's role in housing. So you're seeing a big focus on rental and on the development of community housing that includes nonprofits and co-ops. You're seeing strengthened and renegotiated federal provincial partnerships. In fact, the government of Saskatchewan just signed a 10-year housing agreement with the government of Canada. It's almost $500 million of program funding meant to help build new supply of affordable rental, nonprofit, and co-op, help with renovation, and to extend rental subsidies for
low-income households, and so that's very good news for Saskatchewan, and good provincial leadership as well. In addition to the provincial territorial partnerships, there are standalone federal programs, which is a new feature that we've not seen probably since the 70s and 80s with respect to housing programming, because during that retrenchment and deregulation phase, the thinking was very much to that British North America Act way back to the late 19th century. It's the province's problem. We'll transfer money, but this is up to the provinces. But this national housing strategy also includes new supply programs under a rental construction financing initiative and a co-investment fund. Are they all perfect? Well, they're working on it, but it's interesting that you can go and knock on CMHC's door again, and there's actually programs and funding there to develop housing again. There's direct rental subsidies to be delivered and renewed through the co-op and community housing sector, as well as there's a Canada Lands initiative that will identify surplus government lands and make it available for the creation of a new supply of rental housing. Another feature that's very unique, and I'm actually shocked to see it actually coming into law and legislation. The budget that was just passed federally includes a progressive approach to realize the right to housing, recognizing housing as a human right. We don't have that in Canada, but there are. It's early yet, and it's far from a guarantee. But the budget implementation bill includes some direction to take steps to start to realize the right to housing in Canada and entrench it into law. So that was all sort of a big focus of the National Housing Strategy. But going back to what the news media and the pundits are talking about, it's, home builders and real estate agents and lenders are really ticked off that they can't lend to a big group of people who were eligible for mortgage lending, but are currently not eligible for mortgage lending as a result of the lower amortization periods and the introduction of a stress test. The stress test is a mechanism that it's inevitable that we're in a rising interest rate environment, and the stress test basically asks borrowers to prove that they can afford that upward pressure in interest rates. So everyone's very focused on the stress test, but we've actually got over 10 years of federal governments, conservative and liberal, who have been taking active measures and leadership roles in trying to cool the housing market, where this really unhelpful demand is spiking prices and restricting the supply. So the federal government said in its most recent budget that, well, I guess we got to do something, but what can we do that will cause as little damage as possible? And so they came up with this thing called the first-time homebuyer incentive. So that's going to be $125 billion over 3 years, and it's basically a shared equity mortgage. So the federal government, through CMHC, will actually take an equity share in your mortgage between 5 and 10%. 5% for existing housing stock, 10% for new builds. It's limited to folks, to households with incomes of less than $120,000 per year. And the reason for that is it's trying to be highly targeted while not creating upward pressure on, while not stoking unhelpful demands and spiking prices. So CMHC's sort of data and research minds, they estimate that it would have an inflationary impact on prices of 0.3 to 0.4% over the life of the program, which is a lot less than the forecast on what would be happening if there wasn't currently a stress test. It's suggested that prices would inflate another 3.4% if there weren't a stress test. So, so that is currently this federal government's national housing strategy and what it's most focused on. So I'm prepared to conclude here with just looking ahead and wanting to maybe start the discussion about, what questions are really important to you with respect to housing and housing affordability in this upcoming election, and how can you interpret the policy and platform commitments in a more discerning way, thinking about who actually benefits the most from what might be promised by the federal parties in this upcoming election. The economy is very vulnerable. I don't need to speak too much to that here in this room. I know the ongoing downturn in oil and gas, trade wars, and sky-high household debt make for a very vulnerable economy. In his annual letter, in the annual report to Canadians from CMHC, the president and CEO of the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, Evan Siddall, said this. He said, "Our indebtedness exposes us to much greater losses in the event of an economic shock. Worse still, since we need to use our future income to pay for borrowed money, we'll have less money to spend if this happens. This reduced future spending weakens our economic prospects, and it costs jobs. Borrowing future income on such a scale jeopardizes our economy. Our goal," this is CMHC speaking, "contemplates both good times and bad, periods of economic expansion and bust. The specter of housing-related financial crises are serious, and we know that housing's unique character is something that we consume, invest in, and trade. It can promote volatile boom and bust cycles. We cannot ignore the fact that housing boom and bust cycles have preceded 2/3 of systemic banking crises for which housing price data are available." Going back to that block of new voters and whether or not they choose to show up or not in this upcoming election, it's that group of voters, millennials, who are 1 or 2 years into a mortgage commitment. If they suddenly lose their job, they're really going to get hit very, very badly. And so that's why I think it's really important to think about and ask for in this upcoming election that we really work together to make housing central, to really stand firm on the belief that the federal government can't retreat from having a role to play in the housing market and providing housing programming, that there is an important and ongoing role of the federal government, that all parties need to make credible and concrete housing commitments, not just in terms of home ownership, but in non-market, cooperative, and nonprofit homes, and that we all need to be a little bit skeptical of home ownership promises. There's no magic wand to wave that will make it all better. Promises that can sound popular can be quite risky to both the intended beneficiaries and the economy as a whole. And you might want to ask yourself, who actually profits from this? An extended amortization period, you end up paying tens of thousands of dollars more in interest, while weakening the economy. It's something that I'm quite concerned about. So at the end of the day, it's really about balance. We need to vaccinate our housing system from boom and bust cycles, and co-ops, I think, and I hope you'll also agree, play a major role in vaccinating our housing market against the boom and bust cycles. So that is really it for what I wanted to yak about, but I'm happy to generate a bit of discussion as well. So thank you very much. I almost forgot. Marc-Andre was very excited about this. I might have to mail another copy, but if you're curious about the nitty-gritty of housing co-ops in Canada, we actually published a book a few years ago called Under Construction, The History of Cooperative Housing in Canada. And I'd like to kind of raffle it off here if anyone's interested. And I didn't know how I was going to do this, so Marc-Andre, he helped me out with an idea. So,
do you want to do this after the questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you're thinking of some questions, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 50. Whoever guesses closest to that number will win a book. Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Questions?
Yeah, I wanted to comment that you know, I'm looking for the co-op angle on this analysis of housing policy. You talk about how interest rates neither spike or cool demand. But they don't cool demand, it seems, unless I'm missing something, overall for housing. People still need housing. They shift demand from private homeownership to other forms of housing, and some homelessness, and some staying in your parents' basement, probably. But I just, there's an interesting interaction between the private and the rental and the condo and all these other markets. And I just wanted to point that out. That people have to live somewhere. So, and I think we live in an environment where there's something perverse going on, and I don't quite understand it, where rents seem high and very sticky on the downside. And yet people don't want to build rental housing very much, and I think it's partly they don't like to manage it. I wanted to bring up an example. In the United States, I teach community development and so on. So 20 million Americans live in trailer parks. We don't have that kind of a number here. And one of the interesting movements is this sort of called resident-owned communities network, which helps. Well, increasingly these trailer parks are owned by billionaires. But the older people who are selling off their mom-and-pop trailer parks, they usually sell them to corporations that are very large, which immediately raise the rents. And people are captive. They can't move these old trailers. They're very expensive. They're not really mobile. So there's a network of co-op people that are helping form housing co-ops and mobile home parks. And it's quite a successful movement to essentially take this very vulnerable set of housing users or vulnerable, poorly housed people and create a more secure environment for them. But it struck me that we don't have that many housing trailer parks, but that would be a good model to look into here, even for the ones we do have. We have some here in Saskatchewan. You can imagine what it's like to live in those at 45 below. Right here in Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. But my question is, could that model be used also, to really spur things when buildings are being sold? In other words, so we have all this housing stock, we have apartment buildings, and they're being sold by people all the time. And when they're sold, that creates a problem for the people who live there. They're converted to condos, or the rents go up or whatever. What about a policy which would allow the people who live in apartment buildings to become joint owners of that apartment building through a co-op? Is that ever being discussed?
The past is present, because that's a couple things. One, we actually we have a new member of CHF Canada, and it's a cooperative housing association structured as a trailer park, so that's happening. Two, some of the most successful housing co-ops today in Canada are examples of resident conversions of an existing private rental. Just down the street from our office in Ottawa, in the early 80s, there was this apartment, and it wasn't a case of today of when private rentals being sold and converted to higher end of market product, but this landlord just wasn't filling the oil tank in the wintertime. So, it's Canada, and Ottawa is also pretty cold in the wintertime. So the residents kind of organized, and they called the gas company and the oil company, and the oil company said, well, our accounts with the landlord, we so they offered to pay the bill, and they said, no, our account's with the owner. So they organized into a tenants association and got a real estate agent and organized and were able to put in an offer to the landlord, and they bought the building without the landlord even knowing he was dealing with the residents of the building. So absolutely, I mean, it's something that we've seen before, but even now, it's how do we do that at a bigger scale? Because one trend that I didn't jam into this talk here is the growing role of real estate investment trusts in our markets across the country. And they are hoovering up older rental stock, and they're rent-evicting people, or they're converting it to condominium, investor-owned condominiums. And so when we think about growth of co-op housing, acquisition and conversion needs to be a very big part of that. But how do we do it at a more replicable and scalable approach? Because we're really facing a David versus Goliath situation in the housing markets in Canada. One very promising practice is basically everyone familiar with the concept of a land trust or a nature trust or a national park, saying we're going to take this land and we're going to designate it for this preserve it for this particular use, and we're going to do that in perpetuity. And so we think at CHF Canada that the creation of and support of existing community land trusts in Canada, of which going across the country there are about 30 community land trusts that currently own land and are adding to their portfolio, is one way that we can do that in a much more replicable and scalable and aggressive manner, because we're really in a David versus Goliath situation.
So how optimistic are you that the new federal housing strategy is going to help the cooperative housing sector?
Well, it all depends on what direction the federal government takes in October.
Okay, right, okay.
And so that's why we want to make housing central. And
With the current plan, the demand's got to come also from the bottom. Like, how ready are we as communities? Because I feel like this memory of cooperative housing has been kind of lost. Right? Lots of people don't know what it is. So how ready are we to?
We're not ready.
Yeah.
And that's why we're having conversations like this.
Yeah.
We're trying to from a national membership level is trying to figure out where can we create hubs of capacity, where can we partner where there is development capacity, because there's no shortage of technical expertise in the development of housing in Canada. We can see that through the actual number of housing starts in any given year. What's missing is that connection to how to develop the co-op in a sustainable way. I think there's some very good capacity here.
Thanks for the presentation. Just following up on that, I'm going to just make a couple of comments and then pose a question. So, the question was asked earlier, where are those savings coming from on the co-op side? Is it coming from, it could be one or both, is it coming from subsidies that are being provided by government, or is it coming from essentially the reduction of these sort of agency problems within the organization and this non-exploitation, sort of less exploitation, and so it's one of those two. If it's the first one, then what you really have to rely on is the federal government, and maybe some of the provinces, dumping a ton of money to get anything even up to 1.5% of you could do the math, it would be billions that would be required just in the subsidies alone. If it's the other one, then what you need is a different mechanism to actually mobilize these units in the first place. And just picking up on what your response to Jen was, it seems to me that what you actually need is a development, I'm going to call it a development corporation, that's just out there to independently, with a completely separate source of money, not pure Ottawa housing where they have to kind of do that collective action, which is really hard stuff, but a corporation that's just run that can do your own vacuuming up of properties, develop them, and then turn them over to groups ready-made for cooperative housing. I don't think unless you can do that, or unless you think that the federal government's got tons of cash, that you're going to get it. Now that's my comment. I'll ask you to respond. And I've kind of made it black and white, and I don't mean to, but because I know there's many more nuances. But that's, as I listen to your presentation, that's where I see it. I see it bifurcating into these kind of two outcomes.
Well, you just set me up for just the ability to say quite confidently that it's both, right? It's the actual business structure that creates the affordability, the democratic and principled operation, and that does have a real result on the costs borne by the folks who live in a housing co-op, and also the role of the federal government in having a balanced approach to housing, not just focused on home ownership, but really how do we build more non-market housing, and then how do we do that at a greater scale? That's what we're aiming for in some aspects. As I said, there's already 2,300 housing cooperatives in Canada. So, yeah, you can start from scratch and you can do one-offs, and we're not going to ever get in the way of that. But, we think it might be more advantageous to create that development expertise and scale and deploy it at a national level, work with existing co-ops who want to expand their portfolio, but also heavily invest in the creation of community land trusts, because that really integrates and gives you the full meal deal and creates a lot of interesting partnership opportunities.
So I'm interested in seniors housing, and I'm wondering if you see many examples of cooperative seniors housing, specifically for seniors. Looking 20, 30 years down the road, it looks like we're going to have a real shortage of quality seniors housing. So do you see any movements in that direction?
If we look next door, we've actually, in Manitoba, we've seen Thompson Lyon Seniors, and we've actually seen development of 2 new seniors housing co-ops. And what's really neat about that is it was done at first without any government assistance. The government came in later and said, oh, we're going to partner with you to layer in a deeper level of affordability. But by golly, they got organized and used a share structure and community involvement to build. And they're busy working on phase 2 and phase 3 as well. So there's, some good individual examples there. In Ontario, the Golden Girls Act was just passed to, while not a cooperative in the sense that of CHF Canada's members, it does clarify and cut a lot of the red tape around co-housing too, which is pretty economical way of living too. Oh.
I'm gonna take my turn, Jen. Yeah. So I love I think your message is spot on, the inoculation message. I mean, given the political climate, the former GR sees the value in that. So kudos on that.
As long as there's not any anti-vaxxers in the room.
Right. Sure. Yes. But it does seem to me. So I have a policy question, but just a little preamble before that. I mean, it seems to me that the situation we find ourselves in is the result of policy decisions that were made that are not, you didn't focus on. So one of them was the expansion of the federal government to support securitization of mortgages. Mm-hmm. This happened in the late 80s, or mid to late 80s, we had the first big housing bubble in the late 80s into the early 90s. That crash almost brought down the Canadian economy. And then we've just seen that carry on, and the government's doubling down all the time on the securitization policy framework, and that helps the banks make more lending and credits, do more lending. It fuels the demand side, and the supply side is not very responsive, and you get these inflation effects. And so there's that policy that's not even up for discussion. It's too complicated to talk in an electoral context about, but I think is the big engine driving a lot of what's happening. And the federal government doesn't want to touch that because it also relates to competition policy and banking in general. So there's that piece. And then there's our demand, our people here, people around who want security of retirement income. They want these real estate investment trusts. They live on the money that comes from that. And so there's demand from that side. And both of those things are driving commodification of housing. We've seen really take off since the 80s, since the kind of what people refer to as the neoliberal era. And I think those those big policy frameworks are not being challenged and not being changed. So this problem's not going away. It's basically what I'm saying. And there's two policy issues I'd like you to talk about that might make a little bit of a difference. One, we talked about the regulatory burden. You were telling me a lot of the co-op housing entities that exist now have no capacity to expand or develop new housing because they're just buried in reporting requirements for the federal government. So what are your thoughts about that? And then the other question I have is CMHC's talked about equity co-ops, which just seem to me like more marketization. I'm not really sure what the co-op angle is there on the equity co-op. So maybe you could talk about that as a policy idea that's being floated around. It's not clear to me where the co-op piece fits there. It just looks like they're getting more financialization, I guess. So those are my two questions.
So a really simple question from Marc-Andre. Just to the first part, and that just like some of the fundamental beliefs of how our housing system works and how it's been completely de-risked for lenders, and we're just in this boom and bust cycle. That's why as one of the framing questions for the selection is thinking about who actually benefits from these policies, right? Because there is really no risk for the lenders in the way our market's currently securitized. So the federal government is taking on more role and putting more taxpayer money at risk. We're taking on more of a role, and because we're paying those taxes, we're living in a more unaffordable climate in all aspects with depressed wages, and then we pay even more because we consciously of it or not, when the interest rate's lower, we just hoover up more debt. So we're paying for it, and who's profiting, right?
So I know the answer you want. I think what I hear you saying is you want to see banks and credit unions, perhaps. But I think ultimately it's the people who have retirement income streams who depend on those processes. Securitization, pension funds invest in the securitized mortgages; they get an income stream, and that's where the pressure's coming from. It's ultimately us.
Could be.
Anyway, so the policy question.
Yeah. So anyway, that's. Yeah, the question on regulation. So talking about like not sharing any of the risk. Interestingly enough, housing co-ops and community housing were developed in that sort of post-war welfare state in almost a zero risk environment. And in exchange for that zero risk environment, there is a very heavy amount of regulation and restriction on what co-ops can and can't do while they're paying down their very first mortgage and have an operating agreement with CMHC or whatever provincial housing corporation there is. Severe restrictions on what you can spend your money on and how you can spend your money and how you can allocate surplus. I see some nodding from my co-op friends who are aware of some of these restrictions. So we're collectively, co-ops across the country are sitting on about an $8 billion real estate asset. So as mortgages are paid down and operating agreements come to an end, co-ops will be free to be more enterprising and think about, okay, how do we want to save? Where do we want to invest our money? How do we want to deploy surpluses? How might we work together cooperate with other cooperatives to be more than an organization that is a reporting organization accountable to government, because that's what happens when you have a heavily regulated sort of system, to how do we become more accountable to our members, and going to the principle of open and voluntary membership, not only our members but our neighbors who want to be members, and think about how we can deploy surplus and invest in creation of new housing co-ops. So that's very exciting. But it's sort of like the training wheels are coming off, and we're entering a new era, and we'll see where we go. Equity co-ops? Yeah, because it's a really simple 3-part question. Yeah. Equity co-ops. I mean, we as an association, our mandate is specific and dedicated to nonprofit co-ops, because we think that that's maybe the safest bet on how to vaccinate a part of the market from the volatility and the boom and bust. That being said, equity co-ops. A lot of equity co-ops were developed in Canada prior to condominium legislation, and some of them have actually continued even to this day. And they're another choice. So I'm going to say a politically safe answer here, and I can say we can never have enough choice in the housing market, because that's a part of the problem. There's not a lot of choice. So raffle time?
I think we were at raffle time.
I think we're good. Yeah.
So
I didn't think this through. I should have brought some little tickets. It's going to sound like the Price is Right here, because, but I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 100, and I'm just going to listen very closely, and hopefully between 1 and 100. Let's narrow it down, between 1 and 50. Okay. Right here, 22. Hopefully you don't have this already.
Tim, thank you so much. Thank you. Put your hands together. Thanks so much.